Welcome to Getting Cozy with ShaderForge, Lesson 1. So in this lesson, we are just going to start the process of using ShaderForge, and we're going to make a very simple, basic diffuse specular bumped material using ShaderForge. All right, so throughout this lesson, we are going to basically become more familiar with the user interface of ShaderForge, and really just learn the overall process of making a new shader and material while you're working on materials with ShaderForge. All right, so let's get this process started. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create another model over here. So I'm just going to put this guy right there. All right, and we're going to keep the original one there just for reference. All right, so we're going to work on this particular shader ball right here, just as our example model that we can use to test out our material. All right. So the first step in getting everything working, hopefully you have imported ShaderForge already. All right, if not, I would definitely recommend you guys read the process of importing the Unity package on the ShaderForge website in their README documentation. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to Window, and I'm going to launch the ShaderForge window. And what this is going to do is it's going to launch the start screen for ShaderForge. So basically from here, we have a few options of things we can do. We can create a new shader. We can load a shader that we've already created with ShaderForge. We can go to the PolyCount thread, the Unity thread. These are all the forums basically centered around using ShaderForge. You can get more documentation. You can go to the ShaderForge wiki. And finally, we can go to the credits for the people who actually put together ShaderForge. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start by creating a new shader. So I'm just going to hit the new shader button, and it's going to ask me to save the shader in a location. So I actually have a folder here with all my assets for this particular project in this course. All right, so I'm going to go to shaders, and I'm just going to create a new shader. I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to say G2 for Game Tutor. It's always good to have some sort of prefix that you use over and over again, just so you can differentiate your shaders from the built-in shaders or somebody else's shaders. All right, so coming up with a naming convention is always a good idea. And I'm just going to call this bumped diffuse shader. All right, and we'll just put 002 at the end, just so I know that this is the new one that we're working on. All right, so always trying to put some information about what the shader does in the shader name is a great idea too. So that way you don't lose your shaders or maybe recreate the same shader that you already had. So putting some sort of descriptive text in here that tells the user a little something about what the shader actually does is a good idea. So I'm going to hit save. All right, and that'll save that in that folder location. And basically what we get is we get the main ShaderForge UI. All right, so there's a lot of stuff that we can do in here. But the first things that I usually like to do, so I'm going to walk through this, just how I kind of go about using it. First things I like to do, I go over the shader settings because I actually want to give this a proper path. Now this path basically is a link to where the shader sits in the pop-up menu here. All right, so what I want to do is I want to put it in my Game Tutor basic folder right over here. All right, you can see I already have one there. And so what I'm going to do that, I'm just going to type in Game Tutor, like so, / basic, because it's just a basic shader. It's another good idea to organize all your shaders by kind of groups. So if you have things that are transparent, things that are just basic, maybe like all your skin shaders, maybe all just your effects shaders, it's good to put those in some sort of subcategory. All right. And then that basically will put that shader in that menu. So if I were to hit compile, all right, this basically is the equivalent of saving your shader. We're going to compile the shader. So if I look now in my drop down and go to Game Tutor Basic, and there's the G2 bumped diffused 002 shader. All right, so really cool. All right, so then we want a fallback. So the fallback is basically, it means if this shader can't run on a specific GPU on the current hardware, let's say on some old device or on some PC that's really old, well, we need the shader to fall back to something that we know will work on just about everything. So in this case, I'm just going to pick the simple diffuse because that basically works on pretty much all hardware that we have today. So it'll work on mobile, it'll work on PC, just about anything. There's also a mobile version that Unity gives us, so you can do mobile diffuse. It's even lighter. I'm just going to leave it at diffuse for now. All right, so the LED will save for a later time. But the next thing I want to do is I'm actually going to turn off the DirectX 11 rendering for this. I really don't need that turned on right now. And I don't have it turned on in my project. So you can turn that on and off by going to Edit, Project Settings, Player, and you'll find that right here in the other settings. So I turned off DirectX 11 because we're not really going to be utilizing any of those effects in this particular course. We are going to have a shader series intermediate course and an advanced course where we will start to utilize some more of the DirectX 11 features. All right, so there we go. That basically gets our shader all set up for us. All these properties and lighting and quality and blending dropdowns, we're going to cover throughout this whole course. So I don't want to just bombard you with a bunch of information at first. What we need to do is just learn how to become productive and make a really simple shader over here. Okay, so for right now, all the other settings are fine for us. And these shader settings up here basically get the whole process started. All right, so the first thing that we want to do, I'm just going to put in a simple color for our diffuse over here, okay? This could be anything. It could be a texture, it could be color, it could be a constant value, all right? But really, it's expecting 3 float values or a color. All right, so let's go to our properties. Okay, so what we can do is we can create a new node a few different ways. We can right-click in the work area up here. We can say Properties, Color. All right, or we can navigate and find it in here. So we go to Properties. We can also drag it out like that. Or we can type in this little tiny search area up here. We can say Color, and that will actually give us easy access to the color node. All right, and I could select it and delete it. I can right click, create another one, and you'll notice it's pretty easy to get it up and running. So with this all set up, what I want to do is I want to name my property. So all the properties basically, so everything that, let me clear this here, everything that's in this menu set, the property menu set, all right, these are all the values that are going to be exposed on your material. Okay, so if I go to materials here, we have all these properties up here. That's what Unity calls them. This is the color, this is a texture. So what we're doing when we're creating this particular node, we're actually creating this UI element right here. It just gives the user an easy way to tweak the values of the shader. So they're properties, okay? They're properties that the user uses to edit and modify the shader. All right, so the first thing to do, we want to rename the node. Now we can do this in a couple different ways. We can come over to the properties over here. But because we haven't actually wired this up yet, we don't see our property. So what we can do is we can come over here, click on the title of this node, and just call this diffuse color, like so. All right, and that basically gets that all started for us. And then the way to get this to show up in the properties menu over here, we just need to click on this RGB output right here, click and drag, and connect it into the diffuse. And you'll notice right off the bat we get this property exposed right here where we can actually go and rename it and set a default setting, so to something like red or something like that. All right, I'm just going to leave it kind of at that gray. It's a good default. And I'm going to hit Compile Shader. Whenever this button is yellow, we should try to hit the button. That way we can make it green. And really what happens is it's compiling the shader in the background for us, is writing all the code for us. That way we know if the shader works or if it's broken, so on and so forth. All right. So with that done, let's actually come into, let's close this window, the Shader Forge window. I'm going to come into my materials folder, and what I want to do is create a new material. Because in order to have a shader operate on our object, we need to assign it to a material, and the material has to be assigned to the object. That's how the workflow works. All right. So what I'm going to do is just call this basic diff spec mat. All right, and I'm going to drag that onto my model up here, and I'm going to assign the proper shader to it, so the shader we just started, so this bump diffused 02. And right off the bat, you'll notice now our inspector has changed up here. We actually have our diffuse color node or property. And this allows us to change the color of the surface. So really quickly, we're able to get a shader up and running without knowing any sort of shader code or anything like that. And we already have properties, and we already have it working with the lighting inside of Unity. So everything's going pretty good. So if we want to get back to our particular shader, we can just launch the Shader Forge window over here, and we can say load shader, and we can go navigate to that shader, and that'll launch the shader inside of Shader Forge. All right, I'm going to close this, or we can hit this Open Shader in Shader Forge button on the material itself, and that will launch and do the same thing. All right, so there we go. That is pretty much the basics. That's your bare bone basics of working with Shader Forge inside of Unity over here. So let's get a couple more things hooked up to really finish off this lesson. What I want to do is pump something into the specular and the gloss. That way we have a specular highlight on our particular model. So I'm going to go to Properties again, select Slider, and this slider is going to control our specular intensity. We can give it a full name, or you can abbreviate it, whatever you feel is appropriate for your project. All right, so you notice that when we pump in that specular intensity slider, so the slider is basically just a single float value right now that goes from 0 to 1. You'll notice that we're getting a specular highlight on our particular model over here. And now this intensity is just controlling that intensity of that highlight. So 0, it's just gone, and 1, it's full bright. All right. And you'll notice that our compile button is now yellow, and that's because I've moved the slider and I changed a default value for this. So I can set this to something like 0.5 and then recompile the shader. And there you go. So now we have our specular intensity slider in our properties over there. There we go. All right. And we also have it in our properties in the menu. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create another slider for the gloss. Now this is going to control the width of that highlight. So what we can do is we can actually just select the node and do a Control-C and a Control-V, and that will copy and paste it. But to get it to work appropriately, we need to give it a new name. So this is going to be just glossiness. All right, and we're going to have that go from 0 to 1 as well. So we'll let that compile. And now you'll see if I change this slider, the width of that highlight changes. So we get a super sharp highlight, a really broad highlight. All right, there we go. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to hit Compile Shader. Let's go take a look. All right, so now what we need to do is just pull this up a little bit, and now we have a specular highlight on our particular model. Now currently, if you're curious, what we have is a Blinn Phong highlight. All right, so this is basically a mixture of the Blinn highlight and the Phong highlight. We can actually set this to just being Phong. All right, you'll notice how it changes a little bit, the way that it's actually being calculated. So let's go take a look at that in here. All right, so we get a more spread out highlight there. All right, we can also set it back to Blinn Phong so you can see the differences. All right, it stays more circular, doesn't stretch out over the surface as much. All right, and we're going to take a look at ways of creating our own custom specularity highlights for our models in a later course. But for now, what we want to do is just become familiar with the workflow and the user interface inside of Shader Forge. All right, perfect. So I'm going to close this down, and I'm just going to change the color here just so we can have something a little more interesting there. And there you have it. That is the basics of using Shader Forge and the overall workflow of getting a new shader and material up and running. Thanks so much.